Most people who have been hurt deeply don't think of themselves as fragile. They think of themselves as open, caring, emotionally present. The kind of person who feels things fully and doesn't shut down just to stay safe. And for a long time, that explanation makes sense, because it turns pain into proof of depth instead of something random or meaningless. It gives suffering a narrative that feels honorable. You tell yourself that being affected is simply the cost of being alive, that sensitivity is not a flaw, and that closing yourself off would mean losing something essential about who you are. That belief is comforting. It allows you to keep going without questioning the structure of what keeps repeating. And most people never do question it, because the alternative is unsettling. The alternative suggests that what you call openness might not just be a personality trait, but a condition, not chosen, not examined, and quietly shaping the kinds of experiences that are allowed to reach you. It suggests that pain might not always arrive because others are cruel or situations are unfair, but because your inner world stays available to whatever comes near it. This is where the discomfort begins, because once you notice it, it becomes difficult to ignore how consistently emotional wounds seem to land in the same place. Words don't just pass through you, they stay. Absences don't just happen, they echo. Disappointments don't just hurt, they reorganize something inside you. And over time, without ever deciding to, you may have learned that being open meant being penetrable. That realization alone is destabilizing, because it shifts the question away from who hurt you and toward how accessible you were when it happened. Not physically accessible, but psychologically exposed, internally unlocked, available for impact before you had any chance to decide otherwise. Over time, what begins as a personal tendency quietly becomes a structure you live inside, one that no longer feels like a choice, but like the natural shape of your days. Being available stops registering as an action and starts functioning as a default setting, something the world comes to expect, and you come to rely on without noticing how much it organizes your perception. Messages are answered quickly not because you decide to, but because delay feels like friction. Invitations are accepted even when something inside you hesitates, because absence carries a subtle emotional cost before anything has actually gone wrong. The idea of not responding, not showing up, not explaining yourself begins to generate tension long before any external consequence appears. This is how availability stops being about kindness and becomes about regulation. It smooths uncertainty. It reduces ambiguity. It keeps relationships predictable and roles intact. And slowly, almost invisibly, your inner life reorganizes itself around maintaining that predictability. You begin anticipating expectations before they are spoken. You imagine disappointment before it exists. You adjust yourself in advance, not because anyone demands it explicitly, but because your nervous system has learned that constant access keeps things calm. From the outside, this looks like reliability, emotional intelligence, even maturity. From the inside, it feels like a low-level vigilance that never fully shuts off. What's dangerous here is not that others benefit from your availability, but that your perception narrows to support it. You start interpreting silence as risk, distance as rejection, autonomy as something that must be justified. And because this process happens gradually, it doesn't feel imposed. It feels chosen. You tell yourself you prefer being present, that you don't mind being needed, that connection matters more than comfort. Those explanations sound thoughtful and self-aware, which makes them difficult to question. But notice how the structure reinforces itself. The more available you are, the more situations confirm that availability is required. The more situations confirm it, the more withdrawing begins to feel unnatural, even unsafe. This is not because you are weak, but because systems reward consistency. Once a role is established, deviation introduces instability, and instability is experienced as threat long before it is understood as freedom. Jung wrote that what remains unconscious will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And nowhere is this more visible than in patterns that feel personal but operate mechanically. You are not repeatedly choosing availability. Availability is choosing for you by shaping what feels tolerable and what feels dangerous. The environment adapts to the version of you it can access most easily, and in doing so, it quietly teaches you which parts of yourself are welcome and which are not. Over time, this training doesn't just affect behavior, it affects identity. You stop asking what you want and start asking what will keep things stable. You stop noticing the cost because the cost is spread out, diffuse, never dramatic enough to demand attention. And this is where the deeper problem begins to take shape, because if your sense of safety depends on constant access, then withdrawing will not feel like relief. It will feel like rupture. It will feel like something essential is being lost. And before you can even consider what it might mean to stop being available, you have to confront a far more unsettling possibility: that the structure you've been living inside has been quietly training you to confuse peace with predictability, and that stepping outside of it may require facing a kind of discomfort you've spent years learning to avoid. At the center of this structure, there is a quiet contradiction most people never notice, because noticing it too clearly would destabilize the system that keeps them functioning. The entire pattern relies on anticipation rather than contact, on forecasts rather than experience, on imagined outcomes rather than lived moments. Long before anything actually happens, your mind generates a prediction about what absence will cause, what distance will trigger, what silence might provoke. And that prediction carries emotional weight as if it were already real. The discomfort you regulate through availability is not produced by conflict or rejection or loss. It is produced by expectation. It exists before the event, not inside it. This matters more than it seems, because expectation has no corrective feedback. When something painful actually happens, it eventually ends, resolves, or changes form. But anticipation does not. It feeds on possibility. It escalates without needing evidence. And because it is never tested against reality, it grows more convincing the longer it operates unchecked. This is where the structure reveals its weakness. A system built on prediction must prevent contact, because contact would introduce information it cannot fully control. Contact would reveal that some feared outcomes do not materialize, that some absences do not cause collapse, that some silences pass without consequence. And that absence of confirmation is dangerous, not to you, but to the structure that depends on keeping you available. This is why the tension appears at the very beginning, not at the moment of withdrawal, but at the thought of it. Initiation becomes the threat. The first delay, the first pause, the first unavailability carries disproportionate weight, because it introduces the possibility of evidence. Evidence destabilizes prediction. Evidence introduces friction into a system that prefers smoothness. This is not empowerment, it is exposure. And exposure is uncomfortable precisely because it does not immediately feel better. Understanding this contradiction does not free you from it. In fact, awareness can intensify the pressure, because once you see how anticipation operates, you also begin watching yourself anticipate. You monitor your reactions. You notice the urge to respond. You feel the anxiety before the silence. And that awareness, if misunderstood, becomes another layer of control rather than an interruption of it. This is why insight alone does not break the pattern. Knowing that anticipation exaggerates discomfort does not stop anticipation from doing its job. The structure does not rely on ignorance. It relies on timing. It keeps you from ever fully testing the predictions that hold it together. Its greatest power lies not in what happens when you remain available, but in how thoroughly it convinces you not to begin the experiment of absence at all. And until you understand why beginning feels heavier than continuing, why initiation feels riskier than endurance, you will continue mistaking the system's dependence on prediction for your own dependence on connection, without realizing that what feels like care may be something far more mechanical and far more fragile than you've been taught to believe. Once this contradiction is exposed, the structure does not weaken in the way people expect. It does not fall apart just because it has been seen. It adjusts. What once operated quietly now becomes alert. The system that depended on anticipation learns to defend anticipation more intelligently, not by intensifying fear, but by refining it. The tension no longer appears only at the thought of absence. It relocates into vigilance around repetition. The first moment of unavailability may pass without consequence, but the second carries weight, and the third begins to feel deliberate. This is how the system protects itself. It doesn't resist effort in proportion to difficulty. It resists in proportion to threat to identity. When absence happens once, it can be dismissed as an anomaly. When it happens again, it starts to look like a pattern. And patterns produce meaning. Meaning threatens the story you've been living inside. This is where many people become confused, because what initially felt like a crack now feels heavier than before. Awareness sharpens, but instead of freeing you, it turns inward. You begin watching yourself watch yourself. You monitor the urge to respond. You notice the moment hesitation appears. Silence no longer feels neutral, it feels loaded. You can no longer tell whether absence is absence or strategy, whether distance is natural or intentional, whether you are acting or withholding. Awareness, which was supposed to clarify, becomes surveillance, and surveillance creates pressure. What once felt like reflex now feels like responsibility. If you respond, you feel you failed to hold the line. If you don't, you feel you've done something aggressive, something charged. Either way, tension increases. This is the point where most people retreat, not because the structure is unbreakable, but because it has successfully reframed control as maturity. You tell yourself you need to be more thoughtful, more consistent, more intentional. You try to manage the pattern rather than interrupt it. And that attempt to manage becomes another form of availability, just redirected inward. The system adapts by making control feel necessary and by making any loss of control feel dangerous. This is why simple leverage fails. This is why doing something once doesn't change anything. The structure is not threatened by isolated moments. It is threatened by sustained ambiguity, by the absence of explanation, by a lack of narrative it can organize around. And so it tightens its grip not by punishing you overtly, but by making you feel increasingly responsible for maintaining coherence. At this stage, even the idea of freedom feels suspect, because freedom has been framed as something that must be managed carefully to avoid harm. Control becomes exhausting, but releasing control feels worse. And this is the quiet bind that keeps the structure intact long after it has been understood. The belief that safety depends on constant regulation, and that letting go, even slightly, will cause something irreparable to happen. By the end of this stage, the question that begins to form is no longer about how to stop being available or how to withdraw correctly, but whether the very need to decide, manage, and control has become the source of the tension itself. At a certain point, something subtle begins to change, not because you decide to change it, but because the structure that once required constant regulation starts losing its grip. Not dramatically, not all at once. There is no moment of empowerment, no sense of victory, no feeling of having finally figured something out. What happens instead is almost disappointing in how ordinary it feels. The tension that once demanded your attention begins to thin out, not because you mastered it, but because it no longer has the same material to work with. The urge to be available doesn't disappear. It simply stops carrying authority. It becomes one signal among many rather than the command it once felt like. You notice that not responding does not require justification in the way it used to. Not because you've become stronger, but because the internal demand has weakened. The system that relied on constant prediction loses accuracy when it is no longer fed the same confirmations. Over time, avoidance begins to introduce tension of its own. Explaining feels heavier than remaining silent. Presence feels less urgent than it once did. And this reversal does not feel liberating at first. It feels disorienting. For a long time, effort and vigilance were how you knew who you were. Letting go of them leaves a quiet emptiness that can easily be mistaken for loss. This is where many people panic and try to reassert control, to rebuild identity around discipline or boundaries or self-respect. But nothing here is being built. Something is being rendered unnecessary. The question of authority stops making sense in the way it once did, because there is no longer a single internal voice demanding management. You are not deciding to withhold access. You are failing to produce the same urgency that once drove you. Availability no longer feels like proof of goodness, and absence no longer feels like danger. It simply feels neutral. And neutrality is unsettling when your inner world has been organized around tension for so long. This is why the promise that nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again is so often misunderstood. It does not mean you become numb. It does not mean you become untouchable. It means that harm loses the intimacy it once had. Without constant access, experiences no longer reach you at the same depth. They register, but they do not reorganize you. Pain can still occur, but it no longer defines. It no longer instructs. It no longer determines who you must be to survive it. Jung described individuation not as becoming better, but as becoming whole, and wholeness does not require exposure to everything. It requires containment. When containment is present, the world does not disappear, but its ability to wound you diminishes, not because you are stronger, but because you are no longer organized around being reachable. There is no triumph in this, no declaration, just a quiet recognition sometime later that you've stopped explaining, stopped adjusting, stopped making yourself available in ways that once felt automatic. And when you notice it, the most unsettling realization is not that you've changed, but that you ever mistook constant access for connection, or constant vigilance for freedom in the first place.